So just to start off with, if you could just tell me your name, a little bit about yourself, and how you see your work as an aspect of collaboration.
Okay. So my name is Farzana Doctor, and I'm a social worker, half-time, as well as an author and an activist. That's sort of how I see myself. And I guess in terms of how my work maybe contributes or is part of queer liberation is I think a little bit about how the role of the artist is to challenge the status quo. And so often in the characters that I write and the kinds of issues that I write, there are aspects of kind of intersectionality of queer cultures and some of the struggles that people face. And then I think as a social worker too, I work from an anti-oppressive perspective, so that means helping clients understand, not just how the things that they're dealing with, come from their own individual kinds of stories, but also from the larger stories of our society.
And can you share with us experiences, so either as an activist, an academic, an author, or otherwise, that you think have had a significant impact on how we think about queer liberation, either as a theory or as something we practice?
Experiences I've had. Can you kind of tell me what that means?
So we've had some people who, for example, have talked about events in the past that they attended that they still see as quite formative to the movement. We've had other people talk about their current job, for example, and how they see it as connected to queer liberation or not. We can also skip it if you don't want it.
Yeah, I'm just now thinking like, huh?
When you're writing everything, what you do and how you interact with people, that's all part of it.
Okay.
That's sort of what we're asking earlier.
Well, I guess, my experiences of an author probably have taught me something about my role in this movement, in the sense that, I'll often have feedback from young queer, Muslim, South Asian folks writing to me saying, I've never read a story, I've never read a book that somehow reflected my experience. And so that's how I continue to know that it's important to write about these experiences and make the invisible visible. So I guess that's one experience that informs how I work. I also think that as a social worker, so often we are trained to, people in our society are really trained to blame ourselves for our experiences and not really see how the shame that we're experiencing is really societally based. And so when I see clients kind of have those aha moments where they understand that they're not alone and this is actually a much bigger problem than their own individual problem, and that the shame doesn't belong to them, and that really lands for them, that also kind of informs my understanding of queer liberation. Answer the question. I guess it's about grounding it in something real, right? Yeah, that you do.
And it's the same way.
Yeah.
It's very much you know what this is too.
Yeah.
And so that's it.
Okay. Cool.
So I think you've somewhat answered this, but maybe we can just synthesize it all together. How would you define your role in the queer movement?
I think my role in the queer movement is as one of the members of the queer community, one of the many members of the queer community. We all have a role to play, and I play out that role through being an activist and being a social worker and being an author and contributing in the particular and small ways that I can.
So the first definition question, how would you, or perhaps would you, define queer liberation?
I think of queer liberation as something that is a little bit different from how we understand gay liberation. Recently there's been a lot of talk about how in the last 10 to 15 years there's been a real focus in our community around living our lives in really heteronormative ways. So I think, with the advent of, the ability to get married, for example, our abilities to have children, all that kind of stuff. As more and more people are doing that, it seems like people are, not everybody, but some people are moving from kind of a community focus in how they identify as queer to more an individual, domestic kind of experience of being queer. And there's nothing wrong with that. People really should have the choice to live their lives in the way that they want to live their lives. But I think it's a real mistake for us to lose that community orientation, to remember that, you know, we're all queer in some kind of way, all of us, right? And how we define queer is quite different. But we're all queer, and we live in a society that, you know, doesn't want to see that, that wants to have us live in, you know, some really very mainstream ways. And so for me, queer liberation is more than just about establishing rights around equality. It's about really pushing the boundaries of how we're supposed to be living our lives. So just to give you an example, while I support same-sex marriage, and I think that people everywhere should have a right to do that if they want to do that, it's also really severely limited. You know, we're still talking about two people getting married. What about polyamorous families? What about triads and more than that even? We're still thinking in really heteronormative ways, I think, sometimes when we're talking about same-sex marriage.
And your answer leads quite well into the next question. So we're in the dissension section. And are there contemporary issues that you see as threatening to queer liberation? We've included a list. You don't have to speak to this list, but the examples are same-sex marriage, the mainstreaming of LGBTQ culture, pride celebrations, postmodernism, identity politics, etc.
I think the mainstreaming of our queer communities is something we really have to be careful of. We really need to be thinking about how, when we don't question some of these mainstream ideologies, how are we continuing to oppress other people? Who are we continuing to make invisible? Who doesn't fit, right? So, we need to be talking about poverty much more in our communities, and mentalism in our communities, amongst so many other issues like disability and, how we perceive older people in our community and youth and so on and so on. We still have a long way to go before our community is one where all of its members really feel like they can fit. And so if we stop at domestic kinds of issues like marriage, we are stopping way too soon. So I think those are some of the issues. I also think that, some of the movements that are really pushing the queer community forward are, the trans community that is really getting us to question some of our gender norms and ways that we see gender. I think sex trade workers are doing a really great job of pushing us forward and thinking about, the sex negativity in our culture and how we see sex work and work in general. And I think the poly community is doing a fabulous job as well in getting us to question sort of all of the monogamous notions that I think we sometimes get stuck in as well.
Nice, concise answers.
Oh, well, good.
I'm sensing easy-headed confusion.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So also in the dissension section, what do you think is at stake? Is it important to be visibly queer, to be in open dissension of normalizing techniques and tactics, and if so, why?
I think it's really good if people can be openly queer, and not everybody can do that, right? It's privilege that allows us to have the power and the safety to be openly queer in a society that is still, homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, all of that. But if we have the privilege, if we have the power to do so, I think we need to try. And I have really seen from my own experience of being out in my very large extended family, for example, in my work, in my art practice, that it can open some doors for other people, right? We all need role models. We all need people to be challenging us, right? Me included, right? So if I don't have role models helping me and challenging my views, I'm not going to move forward. So I think that it is important to be visibly queer, and it's also important for us to be constantly challenging what it is that we're doing in this queer movement as well. And I think, a lot of that is happening. I think about some of the challenges to Pride in Toronto over the last couple of years, and how, this whole movement around free speech came about and galvanized people, and having us think about queer rights beyond Canada. How do queer rights in Palestine affect us here, and why is that important for us to be speaking up? I think about how people have created new forums, this kind of DIY nature of celebrating Pride that has come about. The fabulous work of Sasha Van Bonbon, for example, and others who helped to create Stonewall TO this year, and the Take Back the Dyke March in the previous year. So I think that there's a lot of creative energy that is happening in our community already, where people are challenging ourselves all the time. Oops.
Yes, of course. Changing your eyeline slightly.
Okay.
How do we address competition or clashing of rights? The example we have here is sexual orientation rights versus religious rights. You can use any of those.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that there's no competition, really. All of our well-being supports each other's well-being. All of our freedom supports each other's freedom. And so I think sometimes we do set up these hierarchies of oppression, and we set up these hierarchies of rights, but we need to not do that. When I think about some of the clashes that have come about in recent years around my right to religious freedom versus your right to be a queer person, I think that that's just such an artificial separation, right? Because we know that there are religious queer people everywhere, and they are finding ways to bring those two things together in ways that make sense for them. And I think what's absolutely important is that we never use our struggle for rights to disempower. So we can't use our right to practice our religion to oppress somebody else because we think that our religion doesn't support whatever they're doing. So we have to use all of our rights to bring everybody's rights forward and raise the bar for everybody. And I think, there are some really great examples of people doing that. There's a wonderful group called Muslims for Progressive Values who have been looking at a number of ways that they want to challenge some of the dominant, mainstream, less progressive values that sometimes come about in religious communities. And so, they're looking at the role of feminism for Muslims, and, what does the queer community have to teach Muslims, and how do we support everybody in the community? Oh. Okay, we can go back if there's more.
Okay. Does queer liberation intersect with other social locations? As examples, we have race, gender identity, ethnicity, disability, and class.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for sure queer liberation intersects with every other social location because queer people have all of those other social locations, right? Queer people have disabilities, and queer people are poor, and queer people are people of color, and so on, right? So of course they have to intersect and inform each other. And I guess that's another place where it's really important that, we have all of these movements kind of supporting each other and challenging the mainstreaming, right? I think there was, I'm trying to remember her name. What is her name? The woman who came and did a talk recently, Sarah Schulman, or something? Yes, okay. So recently Sarah Schulman came and she gave a really great talk about kind of some of the risks of heteronormativity and homo-nationalism. And I think one of the ways that we push back against homo-nationalism is we look to anti-racist movements and we look at who gets left behind in homo-nationalist thought, just as one example. So of course all of this is intersectional, and it's because none of us have a single identity. I know, eh? Yeah. Some of us have brains for these things, eh? And some of us don't.
I can work some technology without a problem. Like, give me a computer and
Yeah.
time. But cameras are very new.
Yeah. Guess it's all practice.
Good. Okay. So just actually based on the last response that you gave me, I was wondering if you could provide us with what you think of the definition of homo-nationalism. Because that's not a term that a lot of people know or understand, so I'm wondering if you can just provide us with a little bit of context.
I feel like I'm not the best person
That's okay.
to do that. Let me just try to think this through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not the best person. Like it'll be half-assed, so maybe I won't.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, just as
I don't
as
feel
you
very
were saying
academic,
that,
yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
Because we have our own ideas about what homo-nationalism is, and I, for example, know of Farzana Doctor's assemblages, and so that's how I learned about homo-nationalism. Yeah. That's fine.
I'm always scared of giving definitions for things that are not my area, really.
That's okay.
It's kind of a new thought, right? So
It is, yeah.
For
Very
me.
interesting thought. Okay, moving on then. What can queer liberationists learn from, and again there's a list, feminism, critical race theory, socialism, disability studies, bisexuality, non-monogamy, or any other intersectional theoretical framework?
Well, I think that queer liberation theory has already been learning from all of those other kinds of theories that teach us about anti-racism and the bi movement and the poly community and so on and so on. I think because queer people are all of those people too, right? So it's not like queer people just come with one understanding of the world or using their one identity to inform who they are. So I think that feminism has long informed the queer liberation movement, right? Like some of the early lesbians who really helped to create the movement, as one example. So I think maybe what all of those other things bring to the queer liberation movement is just the reminder that we have to be intersectional in our thinking. We always need to be thinking about how this affects people with all of the other identities that might be a little, and experiences that might be invisible to us, right? Like when we have privilege around something, we often don't even recognize it because it feels so invisible to us. It's just something we have, and we might try to think about it and make it visible, but so often the experience is that we don't think about it very much, right? So when we look at all of these other movements that teach us about things that might not be within our experience, it makes it visible, and then we can figure out how we're going to be in solidarity with people who have different experiences, or how we're going to be good allies and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
What role will academics, artists, activists, authors have in the movement moving forward?
Maybe I'll speak to authors, because that's something I can be quite grounded with. So I think the role of authors and artists in helping to push the movement forward is through providing education in our own kind of special way, right? I think that there's something quite special about teaching people about intersectional experiences through a story, through fiction, through kind of these modes that are sometimes easier for people to allow in really deep ways. I think sometimes that fiction helps to build empathy for experiences that we will never experience ourselves, because we get deep into the life story of a fictional character. And so that's one of the places where I think that as I continue to develop as an author, and I continue to write about issues that maybe don't get written about all that often, I can maybe help my own community grow and develop, just as other authors do that for me all the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's true.
My next book is about this woman who kind of stumbles into a swinger community. So that's been like really fun. But
Literally stumbles into.
kind of happens by accident. You know?
That's cool.
So I'm really kind of hoping to, push people's thinking a bit about, poly stuff and, non-monogamy really.
I mean, that's really quite a front that, society has issues with
Yeah,
so much. And it's sad.
yeah. Maybe don't include that just because it's something I'm still working on, Yeah.
So we've reached the end. I'm wondering if I can ask one of the questions that you hadn't selected, but it's something that I think you may be able to speak to, and you can always tell me
Sure.
if you can't.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can tell us whether or not you think the queer liberation movement is transnational.
The question of whether the queer liberation movement is transnational is a little bit hard to answer as someone who lives in Canada, but I guess what I can speak to is, how I've been informed by people from other places. I have some connections, for example, with some activists in India who, are pushing the limits of their communities and their societies all the time. And so I think it is transnational in the sense that, Facebook and YouTube and all of these things help us to communicate with one another. It's transnational, but it's going to be unique in every place, right? Because the struggles and the particular issues that each community faces is going to lend a completely different flavor, right? So, right now there's this real focus in Canada around bullying, right? That I think got really sparked by, Dan Savage in the US. So there's an example of something that's happening transnationally. But is that such a big concern somewhere else where maybe the focus is a different issue? So it's transnational, but we're all really different and we have different focus, different things to focus on. Yeah.
Continuing from that, do you think that perhaps our transnational history has been one that is ethnocentric or Eurocentric?
I think definitely the way that we think about queer, and even the word queer and all the other words that we use in the queer communities probably are really Eurocentric. We don't have enough words. I mean, the words are expanding, right? And the acronyms are always expanding, but they're still pretty Eurocentric terms. And perhaps people in other communities have borrowed those terms because maybe they work. But why don't we have many more words to describe our experiences that come from indigenous languages, for example. And I know that there are those words out there. Why aren't we using them very much, Or why aren't we that aware of them? So I think definitely there has been this perceived leadership, right? That a lot of this stuff comes from, North America and Europe. But really, queer people, or whatever people want to be calling themselves, all over the world have always existed and have influenced their communities in their own particular ways for eons, right? So, who are the real leaders? It's kind of hard to say, right? But there is this perception that certain people in the world are backwards, and certain people in the world are leading things. And I think that as the communication, that the international communication grows, perhaps we'll come to see how artificial it really is. I'm so excited about things that are happening in India, for example. There are just so many queer film festivals and pride celebrations, and it's all over the country. It always seems like there's some kind of festival happening, and why is it that we think that maybe we're years ahead? Because we're not, right? Why is it that there's a perception that one country's struggles are behind and one country's struggles are ahead? So I think we probably need to be challenging our notions around queer liberation in that sense too. How are people in other parts of the world really ahead of us and have found ways to live queer lives, both in their domestic spheres but also societally in ways that are far advanced? Yeah. That was more of a bumbling answer, but
that was a non-answer question, so that's okay. And so we've reached the end of the pre-selected questions, so I just want to ask, given the questions that we've asked you, and given the discussion that we've just had, is there anything else that you would like to contribute? Anything else you feel like has been left unsaid?
I know. Are there any gaps in your were there things you were kind of looking for, or?
I mean, not specifically. We didn't necessarily go into the project expecting particular results.
Yeah.
Because we've got such a range of interviewees,
Yeah.
it's kind of what people say is prompting us to reconsider and to then go back to the work. I think you've covered such a great range of things. I wouldn't know what else to ask.
I mean, as far as what you do you find that there's a difference within the diversity that you see in society, who you deal with, who you sort of write towards or not, or do you see it as all the same, as everyone sort of are struggling with the same issues, or does it vary a lot? And do you find that exists? So that's maybe something that you didn't sort of necessarily touch, maybe because maybe it doesn't have any.
It's a hard question to answer because, I think it's really hard to sort of generalize. Of course, we all have different struggles, but it's really hard to generalize what those are. I think about my own life and how I came out in my early 20s, and I didn't have huge struggles with my own family, but I know that other queer South Asian Muslims that I know had huge problems with their communities and really had to struggle with fitting in and sorting out how they were going to create chosen family because their born families or whatever were just really terrible to them. So, but then there's this, it's always this huge continuum. There's my experience, and then there's their experiences, and there's everything in between. And then I know that people from other communities also have that kind of experience. So it's hard to say how. It's not that we're all the same, but it's that we're all kind of unique, and in each of our families we have different oppressive things that we're dealing with, right? So for some people it's challenging, religious beliefs. For some people, it's that, you know, racism was a big deal in their families. For other people, it's poverty. And so it's really hard to say, like, you know, this community faces these things because we all have intersectional identities within our communities. And so it's a hard question to answer. Yeah, I always find that a hard one.
I think our entire queer movement and queer struggles are difficult because
Yeah.
we do encompass so many different
It's true.
experiences just within
Yeah.
all the groups that we
Yeah.
are. And I mean, you know, our identity transcends every nationality, transcends every demographic.
Yeah.
And so it's really quite something so unique that doesn't
Yeah.
exist anywhere else.
Yeah.
So the struggle is quite complicated.
Yeah. For sure.
And it's good perspective.
Oh, okay.
And I think
That's it.
all.
You good?
Yeah.
Well, I hope that's useful. I hope you find some good bits to
Oh, yeah, most definitely.
add to the rest, and I hope I sounded